Ladies and gentlemen, that was Harsha Lal speaking there as your introduction speaker. Thank you, Harsha. That was an education for me, actually. I didn't realize there were so few as only 400 skyscrapers. So, for those of you that spent any time in the lobby, you will have noticed 10 terminals. Whilst you are here over the next 3 days, we are encouraging you to Twitter. We encourage you to go to the social media outposts in your lobby area and tweet using the hash followed by Dell Next. And what are you going to get? Well, those of you that are very proactive, you may be walking away with one of 3 daily smartphones that will be given to you. So do get in with the tweeting and walk away with one of the 3 smartphones. Again, 10 terminals outside in the lobby area waiting specifically for you. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce our second speaker for today. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Mark Turrell, who is the founder and CEO of Orcosci and former CEO and co-founder of Imaginatic. His 2 major achievements to date include Imaginatic's Award of Technology Pioneer by the World Economic Forum in 2008 and taking Imaginatic public on the London Stock Exchange. In 1998, he was the first to recognize the potential for the idea management technology, then defined by post-it notes, brainstorms, and suggestion boxes. He was the first to incorporate human and management factors into innovation management technology. A World Economic Forum technology pioneer and young global leader, Mark advises major global firms on leveraging the collective genius of a workforce to solve large-scale problems. His goal is to give a voice to all those invisible employees sitting on great ideas. He is committed to making change on a global scale and is driving work on world problems such as water, energy, poverty, and waste. He has designed leading-edge innovation management programs for over 300 companies. His current work in the mobile space is focused on mobile applications, app stores, and in the non-profit world, the use of mobile technology to support citizen engagement and democracy. Mark is passionate about helping people change the world for better and is keen on finding ways to spread scale good things faster. Mark, you've got your work cut out for you. There's a lot for you to do. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome onto the stage Mr. Mark Turrell.
Einstein used to teach undergraduate physics at Princeton University. His second-year students would get a little bit of a shock when they went into the examination hall, because when they were looking at their exam papers, they'd found they'd been given last year's examination questions. Finally, one brave student would put up their hand and say, "Excuse me, Professor Einstein, I think you've made a mistake. You seem to have given us last year's questions." Einstein would merely smile and say, "Well, whilst it's true that I've given you last year's questions, this year, the answers are all different." Certainly, if we look at technology, I mean, you can just imagine a cab ride 20 years ago in Dubai. Well, okay, there's only one building, it's not hard to find it. Clearly, like, we're living in a city where there are sort of fundamentally sort of new questions and new answers being posed. And I think in the world of technology that we're living in is also been sort of quite dramatic. What I'm going to talk to you today is about the power of doing more. I'm going to talk about teamwork, not in the sense of you guys working in teams, but how you can begin to build together solutions to some sometimes pretty extreme problems by working with people who you wouldn't normally work with, so sort of team members such as equipment providers, engine providers in the case of Dell. Sorry, in the case of the Grand Prix race. But what I'm going to do is that I'm also going to sort of frame this up to give you a little bit of a wider context. I'm not just going to talk to you about technology, I'm going to give you sort of a broader picture. My background is technology. I was fortunate, I was working at Intel back now 15, 16 years ago, and I was one of the first people in the world to use server log data to see how people were using web applications. I did a PhD. I did a PhD because my girlfriend wanted to do a PhD, and I thought, well, wouldn't this be quite fun? And ended up speaking to my professor, and the general manager of Intel was there while I was effectively being interviewed, and it turns out that I ended up being a research assistant paid for by Intel to do research work for Intel and also look at 200 companies around the world. Originally, I was jumping for joy when I was told that I would be doing interviews to find out how people and users around the whole Intel corporation were using collaborative technologies. This was early days of CC Mail, Lotus Notes, early days of Microsoft Exchange. And I was jumping for joy when I found out that I would have unlimited travel to go interview people. It turns out that the project wasn't quite that sexy. The girl that I was working with who was doing her MBA, she got to do the interviews around the world. And I was stuck in a place called Swindon, which is as good as it sounds in England, analyzing server log data, which we all know now what that looks like. What was very interesting then, and this has almost sort of set me down a track of sort of the human being track of technology, was that after she would return from her interviews in Milan and California and talking about how people loved technology or how they hated the technology, I would then go through the server log data to see, well, okay, did these people actually do what they said? And we began to find out that people were consistently lying about their use of technology. Now, what this meant at Intel when I was there is that Intel, we fundamentally changed the training programs to train more people around more job-specific training because we found that salespeople were getting taught how to use computers as though they were desk users, and yet they were always mobile. So I was involved with this sort of curious analytical mind around looking at how people actually use technology through this sort of set of actuality. With Imaginatic, my work there was looking at taking what is sort of suggestion boxes, but it's really how can we tap into the brain power of large numbers of people within your organization and outside of your organization to solve problems. So how do we direct that, almost like create this sort of human laser beam effect of knowledge? I then have been working on my most recent things around how do you spread things. So how do you spread ideas? How do you spread behavioral changes? And how do you spread products? So this is what I'm doing around OrcaSign. And so now I do spread program design, so work with large corporations or startups or tech companies looking at how do you spread their programs. But then I also do the world of extreme problem solving. This is where it is absolutely impossible to solve the problem. And what I like, and you technologists quite often have these extreme problems, what is interesting when you do extreme problem solving is that as soon as you solve the impossible, you change the boundaries of what is possible. Now, before I get into sort of technology and I use the sort of the car as the metaphor, the thing is that, yes, I mean, right now, if you have a Formula One racing team, start off with $300 million and then see what you can do. That's a little bit more extreme. I did pick out here the most recent Indian Grand Prix. How many people were able to watch the Indian Grand Prix? Decent number. I did quite like Sebastian Vettel's primary comment was about how good looking he thought Indian girls were. But I guess he is only about 23. But so I was going to give, instead of talking about Grand Prix to start off, I'm going to give you an example that you wouldn't normally think of as sort of illustrating some of the points here. I'm going to give you an example about how you could do something very quickly, low cost, but with dramatic impact. And this will be talking about how do you get rid of a dictator. So this is 2008 in the Zimbabwean elections. This is the sort of first signs of the election results coming out. Robert Mugabe has been in power in Zimbabwe for about 36 years, not a particularly nice guy. He miraculously managed to lose what was a rigged election in 2008. This was some work that I did with the guy who's now the Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. I met him at the World Economic Forum at Davos very, very early on the second day at Davos. And he says, okay, Mark, you look at collaboration, you look at technology. Let me give you an extreme problem. Right now, my extreme problem is that we're going to fight an election in 5 weeks' time. I have no money. I cannot tell anybody what I'm doing, because if I tell anybody what I'm doing, I would get arrested or beaten up or killed. So, could you come up with a plan to defeat a dictator in a corrupt election? So I said, sure, absolutely. By the way, I'm sure all of you know Wikipedia. The founder of Wikipedia is Jimmy Wales, a very, very creative person. I know Jimmy Wales quite well. He's another young global leader at the World Economic Forum, and he calls me the craziest person that he knows, which I personally take as a compliment. So I said, sure, it can't be that hard to defeat a dictator in a corrupt election. So this is actually when the results started coming out. This is that one of the leaders of the opposition party said, look, we have a database. We've collected 35% of the total vote in Zimbabwe. We have photographic evidence of that. And right now, we have evidence that Robert Mugabe has lost the election. I'm sure you might be interested to find out how that worked. When I was sitting down with this guy to understand, well, okay, what is the extreme problem you have? And remember, I have a technology background, and okay, you want to solve a problem quick, and you want to make a huge impact. We were looking at pretty much, well, first of all, how do you cheat an election? So how does the system work? And the way that that system very simply worked was that you cheat the election results at the back end. You allow people to vote normally, and you cheat the final results. I mean, that's the easiest way to go do it. So, okay, next thing that we're going to look for is a moment of transparency. So I do a lot of work with simple rules. So this is a simple rule called transparency. And in most systems, there is a moment when things are open. So if you just have enough eyes and are able to consolidate the information together and put a lens on it, you can begin to understand. So moment of transparency. What you're looking at here is one of the election results. They had 4,000 polling stations across Zimbabwe. And this was the local election result, so that each local village knew that they weren't being cheated. Okay, this is very interesting. This now means that there's 1,000 places where if you had eyes and ears sort of sitting there, you could find out what was going on. So we came up with the idea of using crowdsourcing for election monitoring. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if citizens were asked to use their camera phones to stand outside the polling stations, to basically await instruction to take a picture of the local result. And this is one of the pictures. So 1,000 people get an instruction off the text message, please take a picture. They go click. Got uploaded to a website in South Africa where 10 students were waiting to turn each of those pictures, sort of turning that into real data into a hard spreadsheet. And within 3.5 hours, counted 35% of the total vote in Zimbabwe, and were able to tell the global press that Robert Mugabe had lost the election. That took, by the way, 8 man-hours to plan, design, and execute. If you look at having high impact facilitated by technology, technology can do incredible things. And I'll also give you a couple of other sort of sneaky bits of insight into this. How on earth do you get 1,000 people in Zimbabwe with camera phones when you have no money and only 5 weeks to organize and nobody's allowed to know what's going on? How also do you make sure that when those people are standing there with the camera phones, I mean, if you knew what you were about to do, you'd be nervous, you'd be sweating, you'd be kind of scared. And so you're probably going to get arrested or beaten up. So in fact, as a design, we didn't tell anybody what they were supposed to do. Nobody knew what was happening. Even I didn't know that the plan was being executed, and that was done by design. How do you get 1,000 people? Well, so this is actually quite easy, and this is one of the spread tactics that sort of more and more people should use. It's called the use of pre-existing networks. If you're looking to spread something, and you can use this within your own organizations if you're trying to spread programs or within your customer base, you find a network of people that already exists with an affiliation, and people tend to cluster like that, and you pretty much take your message or your instruction to package that into that network. In the case of the Zimbabwean election, I was saying to this guy, well, is it a student union? Are there teachers' networks? So what type of networks? It turned out that the opposition, the MDC, had got 15,000 supporters who'd been using text messaging to coordinate their activities. So this meant that a text message was sent out quite early to saying, do you have a camera phone? Are you in the right place? Are you willing to help out? So it took only about half an hour to build up a database of 1,000 people willing to help. All of these people were asked to do is please bring your phones to the polling stations and await further instructions. The people sitting in South Africa with the web server waiting for the pictures to come in, they weren't told what they would be doing, just told, are you willing to read a picture like this to turn it into a big spreadsheet? And then there was a journalist on hand to say, if we have a really interesting story and we want to have a press release, can you craft it and can you ship it out, please? So right now, this is a very interesting use of teamwork. We will get back to fast cars. Because then what we're looking at is a combination of various technologies and also different sort of physical approaches to around solving a problem. There had to be a technology platform in place. And that technology platform had to be very much sort of fit for purpose, because without that infrastructure, it was practically impossible to do anything. Now, clearly, as the infrastructure gets smarter and smarter and smarter, we can do more things. And I was helping out recently with the Nicaraguan elections, which unfortunately the nasty sort of wannabe dictator managed to sort of beat most of the things. But right now then, as the technology becomes smarter, we're able to do more stuff with it. It doesn't have to cost millions and millions of dollars. Quite often it is your mind that begins to shift rather than just sort of how you actually approach and address technology. But there is this notion of working with the right people. In the case of this particular project, there were 4 key groups that had to work together. I was a strategist, helping them figure out, understand what their needs were and working out how to position it. Then there were the group, the opposition party, that were on the ground. There were the technologists that actually built the solution to capture those pictures, to then frame them up, to then use sampling tactics, to then make sure that the numbers were right. And then there were the people that did the work. But this was then an example of teamwork where a group of people got together to achieve some incredible things quite quickly that had a difference in scale, really focusing on that end goal, and then you could see the end results almost immediately. This feels a lot like technology that we're beginning to see today, where we can actually do some very, very meaningful things very, very quickly, see the results, but it does mean we need to work together as teams, not just sort of focus on our own little bit. We can only work together, we can only be effective when we work together. So now let's leave the world of dictatorships, let's leave the world of democracy, and let's just go back to being an organization, and let's use the metaphor of a car. So the CEO is the driver of the car. The CEO, I've got my car, I've got my vehicle, and let's say the organization is the car. However, you don't get very far without an engine. And this is a German term that I just came across very recently, mechatronics. Mechatronics are obviously then, it's not just the engine, but it's the electronics that make the engine work. So clearly then a CEO and the CEOs that run your businesses, they won't get very far if there's not an engine in place to make sure that the stuff actually happens. At the same time, though, we obviously will need a CEO. And then nobody wants to crash. How many of your organizations want to crash and burn? Not a lot. So we therefore need to make sure that we have a sort of steady running state, but we're still able to achieve what we want. And then also then, if we look in the minds of the chief executive, they quite often want different things. So there'll be some chief executives that imagine their organization as some fast-moving, super cool Ferrari. What'll be interesting is, well, do they actually support the organization in their way to allow you to have a fast-moving, super-fast Ferrari? When I've been doing a lot of my work around innovation and helping large corporations do innovation, what's interesting is how much budget and how much sort of headcount, quality people, do they put behind the innovation story? In most organizations, sadly, you end up with people that say innovation is our core objective, we want to really drive sort of new products, we want to drive new revenue streams. And then you look to see what they actually follow up with. And quite often it's no more than a PowerPoint slide and a nice presentation. Now there are other organizations that are different, that are much more pragmatic, that are much more, which would be the sort of the small truck there. Well, we need to work with what we have. We just want to do good business. We want to make people happy. We don't want to be sort of overly aggressive or overinflate where our objectives or needs are. Well, these CEOs, then again, they're people that we can work with. Now, one can quickly begin to see where a mismatch can come in. If you're a technologist that wants to build Ferraris, you're probably not going to be very good at building sort of slow-moving, high-volume trucks. And then there are the other type of businesses where, to be honest, they'd like to go back to 1985. They'd be quite happy if nothing ever changed in the world. These would be the people that loved the fact that in Dubai 20 years ago, there was only one taxi and there was only one building. It was so much easier in those days. So really, they would like to sort of maintain their hold on what is past. You quite often see this in family businesses, where the family business hasn't yet got to that demographic change of the newer people coming in. So you're ending up with still anywhere from 2 years to 10 years worth of stasis within the business. And that's not because the business can't change, but it is that the people leading the business would prefer if things just stayed the same. But of course, remember Einstein. This year, the answers are all different. So if we then start to think about just sort of positioning it from the C-level perspective, and then we can look at how technology really begins to help. What help do we need? Well, we need a windscreen. We need to see what is coming ahead. We need to see what's happening. We need a dashboard. And this is where you get business intelligence systems. If we relate this to an enterprise, in order to run a business, you need to know how fast you're going. A steering wheel. Now this then begins to become very interesting as we start to look at technology then as enabling change within businesses. Already you have some of those early CEOs who are doing their blogs or their internal Twitter feeds or their Jive feeds. These are then mechanisms that people are using to start steering businesses. And I think what's very interesting there is that you have the ability to steer businesses via the numbers, but there's an increasing use of steering business via social communication, via sort of messaging. Almost, if one goes back to a very nice 1924 book that I quite like, Propaganda. How do we persuade people at large scale to go do stuff, to follow things? We've got the accelerator. Right now, sometimes you need to put your foot on the gas and move fast. This is where I think technology plays a very important role, is that technology is a huge facilitator. And I've been in technology for 16 years, and organizations that are really prepared for what's going to happen next and are very responsive can help CEOs drive their businesses much further. I remember doing a project with Dow Corning. And Dow Corning had a couple of businesses. They were doing silicon businesses. And one of their businesses was terrible. It was a deep commodity business, lousy margins. I mean, it was your ultimate horrible commodity business. Fortunately, there was a technology group within that business that said, I'll tell you what, let us recraft it for you almost as a web business. Now, this was 6, 7 years ago when that would be crazy talk. But the only reason why Dow Corning's executives were willing to listen is that this was a business they were trying to get rid of. So, okay, bunch of crazy tech people with a web server, sure, but you want to recreate this business? Go try your luck. Well, it turned out they completely turned that industry around, that business around. Because what they did for the commodity services for silicon, they decided to deeply simplify the business so that their sort of cheapest customers were buying things much more cheaply, but they had less choice. Like, well, okay, you can buy big, small, and that's all you've got. But if you want to buy more, then we go down a different route where we can add services, add some more value. That totally changed the dynamic. So instead of having 200 people in a business, you had 10. Instead of having 1.5% margins, you ended up with 24% margins. And that was a totally technology-facilitated business. Now, what again is interesting is that a business person would never have come up with this. A technology person might come up with this, but you almost need to be given the idea of what we can do. And then this is then pushing on the gas to move forward. Obviously, as we talk about accelerators, you need a brake. Sometimes if you're going too fast, you need to pull back. And again, if we go back to the sort of social side of the business, when you are looking at sort of changing the attitudes, if you've got, let's say, an attitude within the sales force that it's push, 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 and you need to change it, using these social tools that more and more businesses have allows you to manage the human interactions that you have within businesses and through management. And these are things that right now, if your business isn't doing it yet, it's something that you will certainly be doing very soon. It's understanding people as human beings. Obviously, you need to adapt to the conditions. So right now, if the economy, Greece defaults and we end up with another recession, then it will probably mean that some of your organization's growth plans go from 15% growth to 7% growth. Well, that happens. Good businesses are able to survive these things. But we need to know how to gear up, gear down. And one of the very interesting things with computing and computing power, whether it's the use of the cloud or other technologies, is this allows you to scale up your needs as and when it takes place. And you're prepared for those needs. The mirrors, of course. I mean, you have to work out what your little competitors are doing. Very interesting. I did a course at Harvard recently, and it was looking at public leadership, and they were showing how great orators, like sort of Bill Clinton, how he was able to present. But what was very interesting in sort of studying these great politicians speaking is that the class was actually taught very badly, because whilst they would show you the best politicians, they would never show who they were competing against. And right now, clearly in your businesses, it is not enough for you to know just what you're doing. You need to know what's happening around you. I always found this very interesting in the world of tech. So I was very much with Intel. They were pioneers in the use of collaboration technologies and collaboration methods. And their competitors at the time were running a year, 2 years behind. Let Intel fail and we'll be fine. Now, what is very interesting is that the technology adoption curve is running much, much faster. And where you might be those sort of executives, remember that little sort of clapped out old truck? Well, you do end up with executives that would prefer to be driving around in a clapped out old truck because that's all that they want. The thing is, use your wing mirrors. Find out what your competitors are doing, because if they're beginning to do a lot more interesting stuff, you will be forced to. And much, much faster. I mean, right now with the Twitter feed and the live stream feed, in the past, right now you might have written some notes, maybe some people would have shared the notes. You will have people within your own businesses who probably back at the office will be able to start working on things before you have even got off the plane back home. The speed of transfer of information has changed dramatically. And that implies not just within your business, but outside your business. And then obviously the radio, listening to what is going on in the outside world. How do you bring in that business intelligence for what you're doing in other businesses to make good decisions? Sat-nav, I mean, you can the car is a very interesting metaphor, particularly, I mean, I've done a lot of work with CEOs, and you can find out, well, do they want to be in Ferraris or do they want to be in Skodas? But right now, so the car is a good metaphor because you then have also sat-navs. You want to plan out your direction. How fast are we going? You want to avoid problems as you get them. And then obviously you need massive amounts of communication, huge amounts of communication. Remember that Zimbabwe story. How do you get 1,000 people at the same second to do the same thing? Well, that's easy. Going back 100 years ago, I mean, yes, you could have shouted very, very loudly, but of course that doesn't work in a country of 26 million people, where they're all scattered around. And yet with mobile phone, with the software solutions we have, we can communicate to millions in a fraction of a second, and a fraction of the cost that one would have done beforehand. For those of you who don't know what mechatronics is, so you pretty much have the engine. So this then goes back to the role of sort of IT as being the sort of the powerhouse of a business. You've obviously got the engine, you have the electronics. I have a BMW, I have no idea how it works. None. Right now, if it breaks, and yet at the same time, the car is able to get the diagnostics done, so if something goes wrong, I get a phone call while I'm sort of stopped by a lay-by of people telling me what is wrong. So the ability then sort of to tie in electronics with the engine then becomes important. Remember, this is the metaphor. But then also the engineers. You need the smarts behind it, you need the people behind this thing. So they can apply their creative juices to solving problems. They can also put their passion in. If they're really doing what they love and they're working 17-hour days because they're really sort of seeing things happen, this is incredible, and engineers make a difference. Maybe not so much in the case of BMW sitting in a car shop, but certainly in the case of, let's say, the Formula One team of Red Bull, people are really sort of going out there because they really feel deeply involved. Words don't come out. Just sort of thinking about the engine, and I don't want to take the metaphor too far, and I'd like to make sure we have time for questions or maybe innovation or other topics. The engine still has to be maintained. I mean, the thing about IT, and I was reminded, I was at an HR conference last week in Amsterdam, and there was a debate about whether somebody running HR would ever be the CEO of an enterprise. And this is actually a debate that HR people have had for the last 15 years, and they'll still be having it in 15 years' time. And the answer will be largely, not a chance in hell. And that's part of the reason is that from an HR perspective, about 2/3 of their work is to do with managing pensions and to managing the boring bits of employee activity. So the sort of sexy bit, the value-adding bit of talent is a tiny little piece of their work. That isn't quite the same, though, with technology. Technology is a different beast. Technology gets itself integrated into everything. Right now you have smart devices, you have the network, you have the ability to sort of have systems that sense everywhere, like smart grid technology. Technology is getting embedded into everything. And almost every single business now is a technology business. What is interesting for those people that are technologists is that where you have a good engineer and creative to partner up with business people to help them fulfill the business person's goals. Remember the Dow example. There was a business CEO that said, look, I've got a problem, I need some help, and a small team to say, look, we can recreate this business as a web business. So right now, then, it's that having a partnership. I think I can see IT as being much, much more supportive of businesses than HR ever can be, because right now it is the engine. But at the same time, then, it has to work. I remember in my Imaginatic business when I had the only deep argument I ever had with my chief technology officer was when our telephone system would die and the email system would die. And then it turns out, of course, you don't get credits for doing the new stuff if sometimes you let the core operations fail. And I think this is something where quite often business people don't quite get the nature of IT, is that there are so many core operations, it cannot not work. It must always work. It must always be on. And that maintenance function is absolutely critical. The optimization function comes in, particularly when you're looking at sort of cost management within your sort of IT shop. I did a lot of work with Georgia Pacific in the United States, where they sort of acquired quite a large IT organization. But they got acquired by another firm, and they were looking at, okay, I mean, we just need to deliver more with less. Now, it ended up sort of more and more technology, but used in a much smarter way. So this then goes into the need to optimize what you're doing, and that's a good thing. Nobody wants to waste money, and as soon as you begin to realize that stuff is wasted, well, you then begin to think. Georgia Pacific was interesting because they were looking at putting about 10% of budgets aside for doing new things. Fundamental new things, either testing, piloting, prototyping these new things, but then also doing the scale-up as well. They'd realized that it's not enough to do new stuff, but you need to actually have a method of scaling this thing up so it can actually go across an organization of 10,000 people, 50,000 people. And that goes into what it would say is sort of trying and testing. I think then it also goes into being responsive to needs. I think it's sort of way back in the day, I remember when I was at Intel, they had the Pentium floor. So they had this processor, and right now, at whatever, 50 decimal places, it wouldn't calculate properly. And I remember there were two almost competing IT teams, and I was in the IT team in the UK, and my sort of counterparts were in California. And we were looking at, well, okay, how can IT help the business resolve the Pentium crisis? Well, there was a team of 5 people in the UK that were doing very rapid application development. This is sort of before, like, the nice tools that we have today. We had to sort of craft some of the tools to do rapid application development. The team in the America had 35 people working on some big, gigantic application. What's interesting, and it was really more that there was a sort of integration of business thinking and IT, the group in the UK always had about 10 times more functionality than any of the people in the United States. For example, and we've all built systems before, you can now imagine that a customer calls up and you've got a sort of call management system. And the way that the US system would work is say, how many chips do you have? Well, we have 10. Well, okay, we'll have to write each one of those separately to fill in the form. We'll do one, and then another, and then another. Whereas in the UK, the system that was built for the European customers said, well, okay, why don't we just allow it to have as many as you want? That dramatically reduces the amount of call time. In addition to that, the people in the UK being more business, same computers, same technology, but just a different lens, a different mindset, then said, well, okay, we can actually use this to help marketing. Because marketing up until this point had no idea how their chips were being used. So very quickly, we can change the call script. We can collect more information. We can use this marketing disaster as a marketing opportunity. And sure enough, that's what Intel did do. And also, it says to the engine, you've got to be there in a pinch. So if there is a crisis, you will roll up your sleeves and you will help. I do want to have a word about the equipment provider, and it was interesting going into the sort of Red Bull, the sort of Formula One teams. I did sort of a little bit more of a focus on Red Bull. I'm a personal fan of Red Bull as an energy drink. But what was interesting then is looking at how important the choice of engine provider was for Red Bull. If you pretty much look, they took over the Jaguar team, which was a lousy team, plodding around with sort of 24 constructor points a year. They changed engines. They were using a Ferrari engine, and then they changed engines to a Renault engine. Well, there already you went from sort of 24, 29 points, bang it up to 36. Well, because now all of a sudden they had an engine provider that had a much more appropriate engine, a much better team relationship, they were able to attract better drivers. The other thing that was pivotal as they were getting in that new engine is there were changes to the rules. There were new regulations that were brought into Formula One in, I think it was 2008, 2009. And Red Bull, just as a team collectively, they were much better off at understanding how the rules work so they could tweak these rules to their benefit. And sure enough, with Red Bull, it is obvious. Who won the Indian Grand Prix? Red Bull. And what's very interesting there is that their sort of number of points per season went from 30, 30, 30-ish to 158 to 319 to I think right now it's tracking at 494 with the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix coming up and the Brazilian Grand Prix coming up. So they're going to do extremely well. But I think what is very interesting then, particularly like in the case of sort of Formula One, they did change the rules around how much money could be spent. So at least you've got to be sort of savvy about this thing. It's not sort of an unlimited war chest now. You do need your equipment provider to be there when you need them. It's interesting as well from the Formula One story. One of the things that they've done is they didn't stop people spending more money. They just tweaked the rules a little bit. So you need to keep your engines for longer. So now instead of having an unlimited supply of engines, yeah, if it doesn't work, just get another one. Now I think you're allowed 4 engines and you have to keep them for the season. So now this begins to change the type of relationship you'd have with your provider. It also changes how your provider has to work with you. Because now instead of almost sort of making more money when they sell you a lot more engines, now they have to really be much more balanced, and you get much, much better performance, and the results have shown that. I think that what is also then interesting is that both parties work best when they work together. And I think this goes into then honestly sharing what your problems are, to then working out how to figure out how to solve that problem. I'll go back to the Zimbabwe story. To design that program took 45 minutes. Just 45 minutes. Remember, it took 8 man-hours to help defeat a dictator, the first time in the history of mankind. And what was interesting is the type of discussion that I had working as a sort of strategy person, and the guy that I was speaking to was an opposition politician. I mean, then he was a nobody. Obviously, once people found out in Zimbabwe that he'd done what he was done, he was on the run and was in jail for a little bit. He got out, and he's now the deputy prime minister. But what was very interesting is that sort of how we managed to work together and how we managed to figure out a solution. When we were sitting down, I needed to know, well, okay, the specific elements, what are the bits of the problem that we can actually address? He'd started off, though, on a much more sort of common, casual basis. The history of Zimbabwe is this. This is how Mugabe has done this. These are the key people. What I think that was very interesting in sort of changing the dialogue, changing the debate, and I'm sure this is what you're going to be having over the next few days, is just to have a different kind of dialogue that is much more direct, much more focused. And in my sense, and I do have a habit of interrupting people when I speak, I said, look, I'm sorry, Arthur. His name is Arthur Mutambara. I said, look, I'm going to interrupt you. I know that you're trying to tell me the history of Zimbabwe. That's not relevant. What's relevant is how is Mugabe going to cheat? Okay, now we know that. Now we know how many polling stations are they? Okay, now we know that. Can we use pre-existing networks? Now we know that. It was much more of a sort of proper dialogue where by both of us then being more open about what we need, what we could provide, what our problems were, we were able to figure out a solution much, much faster instead of playing games that wouldn't work. And I think it's interesting if I compare, let's say, the Zimbabwean elections to, I was trying to help the Nicaraguan opposition party defeat Daniel Ortega. It was a different type of dialogue. So I think, one thing, if I can sort of encourage you and remember sort of the Red Bull success, is have a different type of dialogue with your provider. Treat them more as being part of your team. Because then, by being open with the dialogue, you can figure out problems better. So what I'll do is I'll just make a sort of quick comparison, and then we should have some time for some questions. So if we look at Zimbabwean elections, Red Bull, and obviously your own business and IT needs, there's the same. You need a capable platform. Without a platform, you really can't do very much. And that's not just inside of your company, but what's going on outside as well. It needs to be fit for purpose, which means there's no point overbuilding just because you want to build a nice sort of IT empire. That makes no sense. But at the same time then, once you start looking at, well, okay, we could be growing, we could be scaling, then making sure that you have that capability there. That you don't just have to focus on how much it costs. You're focusing on what you can do, what you can deliver. And I think this is a debate that IT is much, much better capable of having now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago from a business perspective. But then making sure that you are working with the right people. To do the Zimbabwean election, really, that took, there were about 5 key people in there. And I'm actually just, it's over dinner, I should be here for dinner as well. I'm just writing a book on called Citizen Spirit around the civilian work around Libya. So this then looking at sort of how do you defeat this is Gaddafi in the Libyan activities. And that was very much, if you know the right people to speak to, then you're able to get the problem solved almost instantly. But it's making sure you have those right people in your own team, and then also as other partners as well. I think, though, it is also very, very easy to forget that the key thing is to focus on the end goal. And this is, I mean, if one has a criticism of IT, I think this would be a very fair criticism. Quite often we forget what the point was when we're developing systems or building programs. Our point becomes executing the program. We forget why we were doing it in the first place. And I think 2012 is going to see a lot of potential train wrecks, and maybe sort of, for the people here, train wrecks avoided. And that is because if you focus on the end goal of helping the business and adapting, the point is not to sort of execute this gigantic project. I remembered working with a non-profit who was trying to help educate rural children. And his goal is to help 250 million children escape poverty across the world. Well, he'd been doing this for 6 years. And I asked him, okay, well, that's fantastic. You're building schools. This is great. How many children have you helped in the last 6 years? He was very proud, and he said, 220. Hang on for a second. Didn't you say your end goal was 250 million? Of course, what he had done is he got distracted on the sort of small milestones in the middle, and he got distracted by building schools, and there was problems with the principals and everything else. What he'd done is that he'd lost sight of the end goal, and effectively he lost 6 years of progress. Fortunately, though, once you're reminded about focusing on the end goal, you can actually then just sort of, quite often with just a tweak in mindset, sort of start giving yourself different answers to the same questions. And then I think in this day and age, particularly with the speed of technology cycles, you are able to see results very, very quickly. So then you can work out that it is, what you're doing is actually working and making a difference. So with that, I encourage you all to do more as the theme of the conference, and obviously let's race. I'd like to say thank you very much, and if we have some time for some questions, happy to take questions. So anyway, thank you very much. I have a question now. I did realize this was going to happen. It's actually gone. So I'll spark off with a question. Actually, sort of somebody saw me sort of in the break just before coffee and asked me a question around innovation. So this question was around sort of how can we use IT to help people innovate? Okay, I remember who was asked the question. So if we look at, let's say, applying these rules to innovation. So innovation is a very interesting thing. A few things to sort of think of. How many of your companies have innovation as a key goal? Sort of brief show of hands. It's a few of them. So a few different things. There are different types of innovation. So simplistically, let's say you've got radical breakthrough innovation, and then you've got incremental innovation. The best balance for an organization is about 5% breakthrough, 95% incremental. And that's partially because if you're doing the breakthrough, the brand new product thing and everything else, it has a very low chance of success. It could take ages, and even if it works, it counts for a very small amount of revenue. So the very best organizations and the very best IT organizations helping steer innovation is to what I call innovate the mothership. Focused on the biggest piece of the business with the most amount of revenue and the most amount of profitability and help there, because you can see the most amount of impact the fastest. Other ways of looking at innovation, this is then facilitating working with outsiders. Right now, it was very interesting working with both Procter & Gamble and Clorox in the United States. They both compete in certain market segments for consumer goods. And the guys at Clorox, they said, look, we don't have the kind of budget that Procter & Gamble has. I mean, we have nothing like the budget. So we have to go outside and work with research chemists, research organizations, packaging companies around the world. We're forced to do what's called open innovation. Now, what's fascinating is that Procter & Gamble had come to exactly the same conclusion, but for a slightly different reason. Procter & Gamble said, sure, we spend billions of dollars on research and development and innovation. However, even if we have 25,000 people directed at this, that's not the same thing as 1 million people. So what we'd like to do is tap into everybody's brain power. So again, as technologists, this is then working with your organizations to help them facilitate this sort of open innovation, it's called. So this is then working outside of corporate boundaries. I think then the next thing, and this is sort of a bigger topic, goes into the human dynamics of almost using your own workforce and looking at human psychology and behavioral psychology. I spent about 15 years working in the area of idea management. How many of you sort of collect ideas and feedback from your own employees? Reasonable amount. For those of you who do, how many of them collect ideas on a short-term basis, like you have, say, okay, here we're going to have a one-week idea challenge? A few? So that right now, I was one of the people that helped invent time-limited challenges. Because what we found is that if you have always open innovation programs, people procrastinate. They delay and they decide not to do anything. So we then thought, well, it's much, much better to then have a compressed amount of time with executives ready to wait for the output. And we found that by having a short amount of time to gather ideas or solutions to problems of, let's say, a week, you increase the output of high-quality ideas that actually made an impact by 30-fold. So right now, then, the key, though, is understanding human psychology. And it really goes into a domain called behavioral science. Because what you're trying to do now, technology has now enabled lots of people to work together. That can be very upsetting to certain types of management, because now you have the possibility for lots of people to work together. In addition to that, right now, people are sort of connected through networks, and yes, they have their organization as a network, but people are also connected as individuals through Facebook and LinkedIn and others. So right now, there is a dilemma for corporations that you're probably all facing right now. How much do we support people to interact together when, from a business perspective, we just want to do this one thing and do this one thing really well. But at the same time, then, you want to connect to your college friends and I think it's particularly interesting where some businesses have a very large portion of young workers. Dow Chemical went from an average age of the employee of about 54 years old to the average age of employees to about 26. And that was because plastics used to be the big, sexy thing in the 1960s. And all of those workers have now retired. So now their new staff are 26, 27-year-olds. And what's interesting for them is that these people know that there is no job for life. So why should I be loyal? They're much more sort of close to their friends that they have from college than they are from their businesses. So right now, then, how do you encourage your 26-year-old worker as a chemist to not immediately go out in his alumni network to say, by the way, can you help me solve this research problem that I'm working on? There'll be some very, very interesting things, and I encourage you all, if you haven't started looking at this, to get into the world of behavioral science. There's a book called Nudge, which I very much recommend, which begins to look at how can you sort of change architect to persuade people to go do stuff. But I think this is one of those sort of, it's the wetware, it's the human being end, that can make a difference to innovation plus other projects. I don't know how much time you have.
Mark, I have a question for you, very relevant to this region. What are your thoughts on the Arab upraising, and what were the results?
I think that so the Arab Spring is a very interesting thing, because there you really have the power of the masses at scale. If you look at Egypt, for me as a contagion expert, so I'm looking at how things spread, the Egyptian revolution really took place because Mubarak turned off the mobile phone system. The tactic is called agitating the masses. What you do is you want to just piss off everybody. And what Mubarak did is that there were about 5,000 people using sort of Facebook and Twitter to coordinate, and he was worried that these people were going to become 10,000 and 20,000. So, stupidly, he turned off the internet and the phone system. Well, some in the protest movement believed that because there was no access to information, people had to get out into the street and find it. Well, that was completely untrue, particularly if you look at a case of scale. Now, what happened was that there were 55 million people that couldn't use a phone. So you're trying to arrange with your friends to go to dinner. Beep, beep, beep. Hang on for a second, my phone doesn't work. What kind of dictator would do this stuff? What he did by turning off the phone system is that it put 55 million people on the streets. That was what got rid of Mubarak. But I think, though, there are some fascinating things that we can learn within organizations from the Arab Spring. You need a very small number of people to agitate for change to have large numbers of people follow. India has just gone through its own particular thing with the, I guess, the bribery, where you had a small number of agitators say, yep, we think this is a big deal. But to be honest, it's been a big deal for years, so why should there be any difference this year? But now what's happening is that the ability to pick up topics, to spread these topics practically instantly is changing. Now, I can give you the reason for this. I know this is the last question. I'm going to do a quick experiment. Okay? What the hell just happened? Okay, how many of you are given an instruction book on, like, sort of clap in sync? How many of us agreed to do this thing? Nobody. So right now, what we're looking at is that, and this will sort of give insight, when you're looking at movement starting, there is what's called a spark, an ignition. So my ignition was a clap. That is not enough to actually propagate. What you need is to have pickup. So I think somebody over there and then somebody over there was, let's say, the first pickup wave. These are then the people that follow what started. Now, it's random who that will be quite often. Quite often, though, I mean, this was a positive pickup. I've done this before in other events, and nobody's clapped. Well, that is still spread. What is spreading is non-action. In this particular case, the action then spread, and then people heard. We signal, we look up for signals, and then we work out, well, okay, should I respond? And if we'd have kept this going, everybody would be clapping in rhythm and sync, and yet nobody would have been given an instruction on what to go do. The secrets behind this is really then, and the sort of dinner will be a very entertaining conversation, goes around the world of complexity and complex systems, about how we copy what other people do as like one of our simple rules. But then once we begin to understand this, and then sort of the Arab Spring is an extreme version, we can then begin as sort of corporate executives to begin to craft programs to be able to tap into these sort of human nature aspects and complexity aspects to help people go do stuff at scale where it's more likely that they do the right thing. So I think the Arab Spring is obviously an extreme example, and I'm sure that none of you would like to have whatever Occupy Company Limited as a... you wouldn't want to have your employees sitting there occupying your workspaces. However, I think that there was a lot of very interesting things around human dynamics and spread dynamics. So I think that's all we have time for. I'd just like to say thank you very much once again, and I hope you have a fantastic few days. Many thanks. Thank you.